Thank you to the French Embassy, the Gallery of New South Wales, and Culture Plus, and to all supporting contributors for having me here today. The link between Australia and France has been once again strengthened with the current exhibition here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which in many ways looks to bolster the reciprocal relationship between Matisse and Australia by asking, what is the influence of Matisse on Australian art? Well, let's start with the influence of Australian art on Matisse, because in a way, we cannot have one without the other. France has a long history of welcoming Australians, and Sydney-born artist John Peter Russell was no exception, as an expat who took up residences in the south. Returning the favour, it was the Australian Russell who welcomed the French Matisse to the Chateau de Langlais over the two summers of 1896 and 97. Russell's influence, as Wayne Tunnicliffe noted, had a transformative effect on the art of Matisse. In the 1880s, John Russell made his historic journey to Belle-Île, a remote French island off the coast of Brittany. In the summers that Matisse visited Belle-Île, Russell is said to have introduced the artist to the work of his friend Vincent van Gogh. Matisse's style changed visibly after his time on the island, and he is said to have credited Russell with his new understanding of colour theory. State galleries around Australia now routinely include Russell's images of Belle-Île's storm-tossed seas and waters, whose agité is matched by Russell's own tempestuous brushstroke in their collections of Australian art. A contrasting view of Russell's importance is given by Hilary Spurling, who writes that at a certain point in Matisse's career, when he was unable to go beyond the sombre palette of the Dutch and Chardin, it was his encounter with the free, autonomous, and often unmixed colour of Russell's seascapes that gave him direction. Spurling notes that Matisse was so grateful for this insight and inspiration that he named his two sons Jean and Pierre in Russell's honour. Russell was Matisse's South Sea Islander friend, to use Rodin's words about Russell. And Matisse told a friend that Russell introduced him to Monet's innovations and Duranty's colour theory with practical exercise to help him assimilate both. This to Matisse came as a revelation. But the truly fascinating thing about Russell is that he's not only an expatriate Australian artist, he's also the missing link in French art. This is all well known, but important for us to consider here tonight. But perhaps another Australian influence, or at least presence in Matisse's art that is not so well known, is that of the eucalypt or gum tree. The eucalypt arrived in France with Nicolas Baudin, the French explorer who came to Australia in 1801, some 13 years after the new colony was established. Baudin took back many species of flora and fauna under Napoleon's order. We all know of the black swans and the kangaroos, but there are also gum trees planted in Napoleon Josephine's gardens. They grew abundantly in the comparable temperate climate of the south coast of France once they jumped the fence. And lots of other great European artists also painted gum trees. Mondrian, the Italian futurist Giacomo Balla, and Matisse. We could have even gone so far as to say that when Matisse paints gum trees, he is an Australian artist. One of the greatest stories of modernism's travel to Australia is that of Nora Simpson's suitcase. After a trip to Europe in 1913, Simpson brought back to Australia in a suitcase reproductions of a number of artists' works and books on Cubism. She showed them to her art teacher and a number of students, including Grace Cossington-Smith. 2 years later, as though by cause and effect, Cossington-Smith painted The Sock Knitter in 1915, which does indeed look very much like Cézanne's famous portrait of his wife, Madame Cézanne, in Red Armchair. With its green shadows and purple complements, this work is believed to have birthed modernism in Australia. Simpson's smuggling of contraband in her suitcase marked the shaking of Australian art out of its innocence, and through modernism, however late and from far away, began the whole notion of Australia's import of expat culture. But look more closely at Cossington-Smith's sock knitter, away from the black lines and brilliant violets, and notice the incomprehensible object next to her right hip and hanging on the wall. Those embryonic lumps of unmixed colour, blue, red, and khaki, the Matisse. And one of the unremarked aspects of this famous moment is that one of the slides in the suitcase was of Matisse. As is also well known, are the other modernist artists who were influenced by Matisse. We have Rupert Bunny doing increasingly Matisse-like odalisques, the John Olson retrospective, which was described by critic John MacDonald as Matisse on bed springs. We also see the influence of Matisse in Charles Blackman's Schoolgirls of 1954, after viewing the works of Matisse in French Painting Today show of 1953. We also see the varying Matisse-like mannerisms in the work of Brett Whiteley. Arthur Boyd also used strong black lines and vaguely Matisse arabesque-like technique in his Bride series. But of course, in the wake of the rediscovery of Chinese artist Pan Yuling, we see a distant objectifying and exoticism of both Boyd and something like Matisse's Lazy under a spotlight. Then we also have Juan de Villa, who offers a kind of queer perspective in his Indigenous Angel and Matisse background and Matisse interior of 1991 and 1993. We also have the Herald exhibition of French and British contemporary art of 1939, which was one of the most important exhibitions ever to come to Australia. It can be argued to have brought modernism to the doorstep of Australia as never seen before. What this show did was bring Matisse to Australia, but then in a more indirectly, but perhaps more importantly, was the 1953 show of French Painting Today, also at the AGNSW, which introduced the influence of Matisse in a more mediated, but in fact more influential way through the work of three French artists who were themselves profoundly influenced by Matisse: Roger Bissier, Alfred Menissier, and Paul Cerissier. French painter Roger Bissier was known for his unique contribution to Cubism. Along with his paintings, Bissier produced a set of stained glass windows for the cathedral in the town of Metz. This is something, of course, we see in Matisse's own stained glass windows. Through Matisse, Bernard Smith notes that Bissier's post-war Cubist works greatly influenced Australian abstract expressionism through William Rose and in varying degrees through Olson and Eric Smith. While in Paris in the late 1920s, Menissier studied under Roger Bissier and was greatly influenced by his use of colour, fresco techniques, and Cubist and Surrealist influences, all of which he got in a second-hand manner from Matisse. In 1945, Menissier also created a series of stained glass windows that allude to religious meanings through their combination of discernible symbols and abstract imagery, again, which he got from Matisse via Bissier. He even exhibited the work at the Pierre Matisse Gallery in 1953. In many of Cerissier's works, we see Matisse's flattened unmixing of colours coming through, as well as Gauguin's influence of the oceanic. A combination of these elements can be seen in Cerissier's own Boys on a Riverbank, which, influenced by Matisse's travels in France, now hangs in the National Gallery of Victoria. These abstract artists showed the influence of Matisse in their colour, the idea of decentralising and unifying the canvas using colour. They were also influenced by Matisse's work in stained glass and a series of churches, the Rosary de Vence being the most notable. Now let us look at the Australian Matisseians. Leonard Crawford was one of the generation of abstract painters of the 50s who were greatly influenced by Matisse via European modernists and their exposure to modern art, either by travelling overseas in reproduction or when many modernist greats came out here to Australia via state-run organised gallery exhibitions. We also have Roger Kemp, Australia's foremost practitioners of transcendental abstraction, who developed a system of symbols and motifs striving to explain humanity's place in the universe. We of course have Australia's foremost abstract artist, John Cockburn, and his Matisse-like cutouts. Here you can even see the Matisse-esque Opera House. Cockburn, like many expats before him, moved to Paris in the late 60s. He was greatly influenced by Western culture, Catholic religion, and Aboriginal spirituality. This was together combined with his deep appreciation for the works of Matisse and his other influences who incorporated religious imagery into abstract compositions. Cockburn attended the exhibition of French painting that came to Sydney in 1953. There he saw the Matisses and was taken back by his use of colour, shapes, and arrangement of elements. Later, Cockburn saw the works of Matisse in Sydney in 1956, when an exhibition of French tapestries showed a Matisse tapestry. He said, "I saw the Picassos and the Matisses, but then I saw the works of a younger French artists like Monash, and that to me was very exciting. Here was the art that was really relevant to the time in which we are living." Here again, we see how the influence of Matisse flowed through other modernist artists and was filtered again by many Australians. This, of course, influenced the 1969 Matisse-esque Sydney Opera House curtains made from Australian merino wool. Through Cockburn via Matisse, France was literally woven into Australia's fabric. Then we have Donald Leacock and Thomas Gleghorn. Finally, we have the appropriately named Leonard French and his most famous and enormous Dalle de Verre, concrete and glass slab ceiling in the Great Hall of the National Art Gallery of Victoria, completed in 1968. As a Victorian, I'm obviously biased in my love for the Great Hall and what it means to me and my fellow Victorians as our own Chapel Rosary de Vence in Australia. Matisse's Chapel Rosary de Vence is one of his greatest achievements and one that he considers a true legacy of his time in Tahiti in 1930. And in many ways, in order to understand the distinctive imagery of his cutouts, we must look at his voyage to the islands in the South Seas. Matisse marvels at his time in Tahiti. On several occasions, he accompanied his friend Pauline and her husband, as well as German film director Friedrich Moreau, who was there filming a new movie, Taboo, a story of the South Seas. Matisse, who loved this movie for its scenery and imagery, saw the film 3 times following its release in France. In many ways, it could be suggested that Matisse travelled to Tahiti to reconnect with the Southern Hemisphere and his memories of his South Sea Islander friend, John Peter Russell. His oceanic works of the time were, in a sense, his own story of the South Seas. It's almost like through the rough seas of Belle-Île and the raw, unmixed blue ocean that connects the Frenchman to his fondest friend and memories of the Oceania. There is one last influence of Matisse, not an Australian, but a New Zealander, Richard Colleen, who is joined to us by the Pacific. It was Rodin who referred to Russell as his South Sea Islander, and this mistaken identification is likely inspired Matisse to take up the trip to Tahiti, thus decidedly changing his practice. Australia and Matisse are connected, and the tide that connects us flows both ways. Thank you.